Look out your window. The towering structures you call trees are not what they seem. In fact, from a strict biological standpoint, the concept of a tree does not exist. We have been blinded by a massive evolutionary illusion. If an alien civilization landed on Earth tomorrow, they would not see majestic, breathing monuments of life. They would see colossal, self-assembling wooden towers that are 99% dead, utilizing a dark, hidden physics to break the literal laws of suction, pulling thousands of gallons of water hundreds of feet into the sky against the crushing force of gravity. They are biological anomalies hiding in plain sight. They are ancient kings of survival that conquered the planet by mastering death from within. Welcome to Shadow Science D. Today, we deconstruct the cosmic anomaly of the forest. Segment 1. The taxonomic illusion. Why trees do not exist in biology real-world phenomenon. When humans look at a forest, our brains instinctively categorize what we see. We see a thick woody trunk, a crown of green leaves, and branches spreading toward the sky. We collectively point at this specific shape and call it a tree. We teach this to children, we write it in textbooks, it feels solid, definitive, and indisputable. It is an everyday reality that forms the very backdrop of human existence. But this visual uniformity is nothing more than a grand evolutionary deception. In the grand ledger of biological taxonomy, the kingdom of animals is meticulously ordered, while the category of trees is a ghost, a convenient fiction created by human language rather than evolutionary truth. Scientific and psychological concept. In scientific terms, this phenomenon is driven by convergent evolution, a process where entirely unrelated organisms independently evolve similar traits to adapt to identical environmental pressures. From a psychological perspective, human reliance on the concept of a tree is rooted in categorization bias and the illusion of descriptive inclusion. Our brains are hardwired to group objects based on superficial visual similarities rather than deep structural or genetic histories. We mistake a shared survival strategy for a shared genetic lineage. In reality, a tree is not a distinct biological family. It is simply an evolutionary outfit that countless unrelated plants have put on at various points across deep time. Scientific evidence and historical case studies. To understand how profound this illusion is, we must look at the genetic map of the plant kingdom. Consider an oak tree and a pine tree. To the human eye, they are brothers. Both are large, woody trees. However, genetic sequencing reveals a shocking truth. An oak tree is evolutionary closer to a tiny, crawling strawberry plant or a garden rose than it is to a pine tree. The oak and the pine diverged hundreds of millions of years ago, sharing a common ancestor only at the broad level of seed-bearing plants. The history of botany is filled with instances of plants completely reinventing themselves. Millions of years ago, the ancestors of modern dandelions and sunflowers were just small, soft-stemmed herbs hugging the forest floor. Yet, when environmental niches opened up, particularly on isolated islands, these humble herbs underwent a dramatic transformation. Through independent evolutionary paths, they grew massive trunks, developed bark, and became what we visually classify as trees. They solved the exact same environmental equation with the exact same physical shape, despite being completely unrelated to the ancient giants of the forest. Long-term implications. The long-term consequence of this taxonomic illusion changes how we perceive biodiversity and conservation. Because we view trees as a singular homogeneous group, we often mismanage ecological preservation. If we replace an ancient complex forest that evolved through distinct lineages with a monoculture plantation of genetically identical timber trees, we assume we have restored the forest because the visual checklist of trees is fulfilled. But in reality, we have replaced a highly sophisticated multi-lineage evolutionary masterpiece with a superficial imitation. On a broader scale, understanding convergent evolution in plants forces us to realize that nature's designs are highly repetitive. When faced with the laws of physics and resource scarcity, completely different branches of life will inevitably arrive at the exact same physical solutions. Segment 2. The cosmic arms race for photons. The birth of the wooden tower real-world phenomenon. Imagine a world without height. Hundreds of millions of years ago, the landscape of Earth was a flat green carpet. The earliest land plants were simple moss-like organisms that grew mere millimeters above the damp soil. They lived in perfect horizontal peace, but this peace was inherently unstable. It was a ticking clock waiting for an ecological spark. Slowly, inevitably, a silent, slow-motion war erupted across the surface of the planet. A war not fought with teeth or claws, but with height. Plants began to stack themselves on top of one another, triggering a brutal, vertical arms race that would completely reshape the atmosphere and geography of the globe. Scientific and psychological concept. This vertical escalation is driven by the absolute physics of photosynthesis and the desperate competition for photons, the fundamental particles of light. In psychology and behavioral ecology, this perfectly mirrors a tragedy of the commons in a biological Red Queen's hypothesis, where an organism must constantly run, or in this case grow, just to stay in the same place relative to its competitors. The first plant that mutated to stand even a few inches taller than its neighbors successfully hijacked the incoming solar radiation, casting a lethal shadow over everything below it. This created an immediate existential crisis for the surrounding vegetation. Grow taller, adapt to the darkness, or face genetic extinction. Scientific evidence and historical case studies. The historical record of this arms race is etched into the fossil record of the Devonian period, roughly 400 million years ago. Before plants figured out how to build wooden trunks, the tallest structures on Earth were actually giant fungi called prototaxites, which stood nearly 24 feet tall like monolithic stone pillars. The plants of that era were still tiny, struggling for a fraction of daylight beneath these fungal shadows. To break this monopoly, plants had to invent a completely new material. They combined glucose molecules into long, unbreakable chains of cellulose, and then reinforced those chains with a revolutionary organic polymer called lignin. Lignin was the prehistoric equivalent of reinforced concrete. It was incredibly tough, waterproof, and highly resistant to decay. The invention of lignin allowed plants to defy gravity for the very first time. The Archaeopteris, one of the earliest true ancestral trees, used this new structural technology to rapidly shoot up to 90 feet in the air. This rapid vertical expansion triggered a collapse of the primordial ground-dwelling ecosystems, forcing a total reorganization of terrestrial life. Long-term implications. The long-term consequence of this frantic race to the sky was the creation of the global carbon cycle as we know it today. The massive accumulation of lignin-reinforced wood during the Carboniferous period created vast forests that the bacteria and fungi of that era simply could not digest. When these giant trees died, they did not rot. They piled up in massive miles-deep layers, compressing over hundreds of millions of years into the coal beds that fueled the human industrial revolution. Furthermore, this vertical escalation permanently locked plants into a high-energy lifestyle. To maintain these massive wooden towers just to capture light, trees are forced to expend an enormous amount of resources on structural maintenance. It is a brilliant yet tragic evolutionary trap. The forest became a hyper-competitive arena where billions of organisms spend their entire lives building massive skyscrapers, consuming massive amounts of energy, simply to survive the shadows cast by their neighbors. Segment 3. The architecture of death, living on the shadows of the past real-world phenomenon. When we walk through an ancient forest and press our hands against the bark of a massive tree, we feel a sense of vibrant, surging life. We imagine millions of tiny cells working in perfect harmony, breathing, pulsing, and processing energy across every square inch of the colossus. This perception is completely wrong. The towering monument standing before you is not a living entity in the way an animal is. It is a biological paradox. A hyper-efficient monument to mortality where life is entirely dependent on its own decay. If you were to peel back the microscopic layers of a majestic timber giant, you would discover that the sprawling organic skyscraper is actually an ossuary. It is a structure that is almost completely dead. Scientific and psychological concept. In plant physiology, this structure reveals that over 99% of the total volumetric biomass of a mature tree consists of functionally dead cells. This phenomenon centers on the formation of heartwood, surrounded by sapwood, protected by an external dead layer known as the rhydidome. Psychologically, this triggers what cognitive scientists call the animacy illusion. Human brains naturally attribute uniform vitality to any organism that grows, moves, or reacts to its environment. We possess an innate bias that assumes an entity must be universally alive to function. Trees shatter this cognitive framework by demonstrating a brilliant survival strategy. They utilize dead structural tissue to achieve massive physical scale without incurring the unsustainable metabolic costs of maintaining trillions of living cells. Scientific evidence and historical case studies. To observe this architecture of death at a microscopic level, we must look at how a tree grows year after year. The engine of a tree's physical expansion is the vascular cambium, a microscopically thin ring of living, rapidly dividing stem cells located just beneath the outer bark. As the cambium cells divide, they push new cells outward to become part of the protective bark network, and they push older cells inward. These internal cells undergo a programmed biological suicide. They strip away their own internal organs, empty out their cytoplasm, and thicken their cell walls with heavy deposits of cellulose and lignin. Once this process of self-destruction is complete, these cells become hollow, rigid pipelines known as tracheids and vessel elements. They are dead, yet they are more functional to the tree in death than they ever were in life. The inner core, the heartwood, becomes completely packed with these dead cell walls, transforming into an internal skeletal column. The historical proof of this design can be seen in historic forestry practices and natural anomalies like the famous tunnel trees of the American West, such as the Wawana tree in Yosemite National Park. In the late 19th century, humans carved a massive carriage-sized tunnel directly through the heart of this giant sequoia. Despite having its core completely hollowed out and destroyed, the tree continued to live, grow, and produce green needles for nearly 9 decades. It survived because the structural core was already dead. As long as the ultra-thin layer of the vascular cambium remains intact, the tree can continue its biological operations seamlessly. Long-term implications. The long-term consequence of this architecture is a complete optimization of energy conservation that allows plants to outlive all animal life. By freezing their dead structures in place to serve as scaffolding, trees avoid the massive energetic burden of cellular respiration and metabolic upkeep that plagues large animals. An elephant or a blue whale must constantly consume massive quantities of food just to keep its internal tissues alive and repaired. A tree, by contrast, only needs to feed and maintain less than 1% of its total mass. This gives them an unprecedented evolutionary advantage, allowing them to accumulate mass over centuries and stand rigid against catastrophic weather. However, this relies on a delicate balance. If a fungal pathogen bypasses the outer protective bark and manages to rot the dead inner heartwood, the tree's structural integrity collapses entirely. The tree does not die from a lack of nutrients. It dies because its dead architectural foundation rots away, causing the living canopy to crush itself under its own massive weight. Segment 4. The suction paradox, defying the limits of Earth's atmosphere real-world phenomenon. Imagine standing at sea level with a glass of water and an incredibly long, unbreakable straw extending straight up into the sky. If you had an engine with infinite mechanical power, or a pair of human lungs with limitless physical strength, you would assume you could pull water up that straw indefinitely, perhaps all the way to the top of a skyscraper or into the upper atmosphere. But physics says no. No matter how powerful your vacuum pump is, and no matter how perfect the seal on your straw may be, you will hit a hard, invisible ceiling. The water will stop rising. It will stubbornly refuse to go a single inch higher than 10.3 meters, or roughly 34 feet. Yet right outside your window, trees defy this absolute rule every single day, drawing water up to heights that should be physically impossible. Scientific and psychological concept, the barrier that stops a vacuum pump at 10.3 meters is the limit of barometric atmospheric pressure. When you suck through a straw, you are not actually pulling the liquid up. You are simply removing air from inside the straw, creating a zone of low pressure. It is the weight of Earth's atmosphere pressing down on the surface of the water outside the straw that forces the liquid upward. At sea level, atmospheric pressure tops out at 14.7 pounds per square inch, which possesses exactly enough mechanical force to lift a column of water up to 10.3 meters before reaching equilibrium. To bypass this absolute ceiling, trees do not use suction or positive pressure pumps. Instead, they operate entirely within a realm of negative pressure dynamics and cohesion tension theory. This creates a sharp paradox of subatmospheric tension. Human engineering relies almost exclusively on positive pressure or mechanical vacuums, leading to a profound psychological blindness when we try to understand how nature manipulates liquid mechanics without moving parts. Scientific evidence and historical case studies. To prove how trees bypass the 10.3-meter barrier, we have to look at the unique molecular structure of water itself. A water molecule is highly polar. The two hydrogen atoms carry a slight positive charge, while the single oxygen atom carries a slight negative charge. This polarity means that water molecules act like microscopic magnets, their opposite charges attracting one another to form an unbreakable network of hydrogen bonds. This intense internal attraction gives water an incredibly high level of cohesive strength. When a tree opens the microscopic pores on its leaves, called stomata, to absorb carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, water molecules inside the leaf are exposed to the dry outside air and begin to evaporate. This process is known as transpiration. As a single water molecule evaporates into the atmosphere, its hydrogen bonds tightly pull on the water molecule directly behind it. Because the internal pipelines of the tree, the xylem vessels, are incredibly narrow, measuring only a few hundred microns across, the water column behaves less like a loose liquid and more like a solid microscopic steel cable. The evaporation of water from the leaves acts as a mechanical winch, pulling this molecular cable upward from the roots all the way to the top of the canopy. The tension generated inside the xylem of a tall tree is astronomical, reaching negative pressures of up to -2 megapascals. This is a state of physical tension so severe that the water inside the tree is technically under a negative pressure that exceeds a total vacuum, existing in a highly unstable metastable state. Long-term implications. The long-term consequence of this subatmospheric hydraulic system is both a miracle of engineering and a profound ecological vulnerability. Because trees rely on an unbroken, continuous string of water molecules, their maximum height is strictly limited by the physical point where the tension becomes so immense that the water column snaps. When the soil becomes too dry or the air becomes too hot, the tension inside the xylem skyrockets. If it crosses a critical threshold, a catastrophic event called an embolism occurs. A microscopic bubble of air is sucked into the pipeline, causing the water column to instantly rupture with an acoustic pop that can be detected by specialized ultrasonic microphones. This is the botanical equivalent of a fatal heart attack. An embolism instantly renders that specific transport pipeline useless. As global temperatures rise and droughts become more frequent and severe due to climate change, trees are constantly forced to operate closer and closer to their absolute hydraulic breaking points, threatening the collapse of entire old-growth forest ecosystems across the globe. Segment 5. The masters of deep-time monoliths of eternal survival, real-world phenomenon. Human civilizations rise, flourish, and crumble into dust in what amounts to a brief heartbeat in the grand scale of planetary history. We build empires out of stone and steel, thinking our legacies are permanent. Yet, while our generations rapidly pass, there are quiet, unassuming organisms rooted in the earth that have stood motionless through it all. They do not possess brains, they cannot move to escape danger, and they are completely exposed to the brutal whims of nature. Yet they possess a terrifyingly brilliant capacity for longevity that makes human lifespans look completely insignificant. They are the true masters of deep time, living historical monuments that were already ancient when the very first human empires were being carved into the mud. Scientific and psychological concept. This endless survival relies on two distinct strategies: negligible senescence in solitary organisms and clonal colony regeneration in interconnected systems. Senescence is the biological process of cellular deterioration that leads to natural death. Animals suffer from a hardwired genetic clock. Our organs wear out, our telomeres shorten, and our stem cells lose the ability to replicate accurately. Trees, however, reject this linear decay. Psychologically, humans suffer from temporal myopia. Our short lifetimes blind us to the true scale of planetary time. We view trees as static parts of the landscape, failing to realize that they are highly dynamic, slow-motion survival engines operating on an entirely different temporal dimension. Scientific evidence and historical case studies. To see this temporal mastery in a single organism, we must travel to the harsh, wind-swept heights of the White Mountains in California. Here, growing out of barren dolomite soil where almost nothing else can survive, stands a Great Basin bristlecone pine named Methuselah. Scientific core sampling of its ring structures confirms a staggering age of over 4,850 years. This single tree sprouted from the dirt before the Great Pyramid of Giza was constructed. It was already a mature, thick-trunked entity during the Trojan War, and it silently witnessed the entire rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, and the dawn of the nuclear age. It survives in this brutal environment because its ultra-slow growth rate creates wood so dense and packed with resin that boring insects and fungal rot cannot penetrate its flesh. But nature has an even deeper level of time mastery. If we look beyond individual trunks, we find Pando, a massive grove of quaking aspens in Utah. To a human walking through it, Pando looks like a massive forest of 47,000 individual trees. But underneath the soil lies a single vast interconnected root system. Genetic testing confirms that every single one of these 47,000 trunks is a genetically identical clone of a single male seed that sprouted thousands of years ago. According to the latest geological and genetic data, the Pando network has been alive for at least 9,000 years, with some upper estimates stretching even further back into the dawn of the current interglacial period. It is a single organism weighing over 6,000 tons, making it one of the heaviest and oldest living entities on the planet. When an individual trunk grows old and dies, the collective underground root network simply sends up a brand new, vigorous shoot to replace it. It has bypassed individual death entirely through an endless cycle of self-cloning. Long-term implications. The long-term implications of this deep-time biology challenge our fundamental understanding of evolution, genetics, and immortality. Trees prove that aging is not an inevitable law of organic matter, but a malleable evolutionary variable. By maintaining highly stable stem cells in their meristems, trees can theoretically replicate their tissues perfectly forever, provided they are not destroyed by external forces like fire, disease, or human axes. However, this reliance on extreme longevity creates a severe evolutionary blind spot in the modern world. Because these ancient organisms adapt and reproduce across centuries rather than years, their rate of genetic mutation and evolutionary adaptation is incredibly slow. They are built for a stable, predictable planetary climate. In our current era of rapid human-driven environmental destruction and skyrocketing global temperatures, the world is changing far faster than these ancient giants can adapt. The tragic irony of deep time is that organisms that survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, and continental shifts are now facing total extinction because they cannot keep pace with the frantic, destructive velocity of human industrial civilization. The next time you walk past a tree, do not just see a piece of wood. See it for what it truly is, a masterpiece of subatmospheric engineering, an evolutionary illusion that conquered gravity by mastering death from within. Nature did not design a tree. It designed a brilliant universal solution to the brutal war for light. And there is a profound human lesson hidden within this wooden architecture. True, lasting strength does not require every part of you to be in constant, frantic motion. Like the internal core of the great timber giants, your past struggles, your old scars, and the structures you have outgrown do not need to be a burden. You can freeze them in place, transform them into a solid foundation, and use them as the heavy skeletal scaffolding to propel your growth toward the light. If you want to dive deeper into the hidden, terrifying systems that govern our planet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for Shadow Science DD. Now, I want to hear from you. Look at the ancient interconnected design of the Pando Grove, surviving for thousands of years as a single network. Do you think true biological immortality is achievable for complex life, or is death an absolute, unbreakable rule of physics? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below. Let us start a debate, and I will see you in the next episode.